From war across the globe to regulating speech to printing trillions of dollars, the American regime accepts no limits on its power. As Ludwig von Mises understood, the state will take as much power as the people will let it. And in recent years, the American regime has clearly concluded it can get away with unilaterally adopting vast new powers. Join Michael Rechtenwald, Ted Galen Carpenter, Jonathan Newman, and more for a Mises Institute event in Nashville, Tennessee on September 23rd, dedicated to this siege of power and one of Ron Paul's favorite lines, "Truth is treason in the empire of lies." Tickets begin at $95. Get yours at Mises.org/Nashville23. That's MISES.org/Nashville23. This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
George, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Bob, thanks for having me.
So
it's an honor.
Appreciate that. So I see that you've got your T-shirt on. You're all ready for.
Yeah.
So for the folks listening to the audio version, he's got a T-shirt that says CBDC, that is of the same font as AC/DC. By the way, so when did you have that made? Like, at what point did you realize that, a lot of my work now is going to involve these CBDCs, and I should have a funny T-shirt?
I started talking about CBDCs pretty much when I first started my channel in 2019. And what was funny is back then, Bob, everyone was calling me a conspiracy theorist.
Really?
Everyone would say, "Oh yeah, George, you're a tinfoil hatter. You're Alex Jones. I used to like your videos, but now you've really lost. Now you've gone too far. Unsubscribe."
Before we jump into that,
now all of a sudden it's just mainstream news.
Yeah. Also, for the benefit of some listeners who you might be on their radar, can you just take a few minutes just to explain like what your conventional background was, and then when did you start doing videos? And in the beginning, was it mostly just like real estate transactions?
Yeah.
And then you got more whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so I retired in 2012, and when I retired, I wanted to invest my own money, and I didn't want to subcontract that out. So I started to try to learn how to invest, and I stumbled across Milton Friedman's Free to Choose series. It was back in 2012 on YouTube. And I didn't know anything about interest rates. I didn't know what the Fed was. I didn't know what a yield curve bond market. I knew absolutely nothing. But man, that Free to Choose series really resonated with me from all my years as being an employee, an employer, an entrepreneur, et cetera. And then I started reading Thomas Sowell, and that got me into a lot of the Austrian stuff. And I started watching videos from Jim Rogers and Jim Grant and Doug Casey and Rick Rule and Peter Schiff and Tom Woods and you and everyone else. And that's what really shaped my thinking. But it shaped it because it resonated with my real life experience, as an entrepreneur. So anyway, I got involved with real estate investing. So I wanted to buy things when they're cheap and sell them when they're expensive in 2012. Good time to do it. Then fast forward to 2019, I'd been doing this not only in the United States, but down here in Colombia and in South America. And I was doing it to such a degree in South America that I thought it would make a good TV show, just like one of those HG TV shows that you see up in the States. So anyway, I actually did a TV show down here. I was the executive producer. I had to do the whole thing myself, hire the editors, the camera crew. It was on a local station called Medellin. After the first season, it was a big hit, very popular.
It was a hit in the U.S. or in Colombia?
No, in Colombia, here in just in Medellin. It was just on the local station here. And so we had big plans to grow it all over South America but anyway, we took a break, and I wanted to keep the employees busy, the camera people and the editors and whatnot. So that's why I started the YouTube channel. But my passion from 2012 has always been macro. It's always been economics. Now I just got involved with real estate. I enjoyed it, but I just kind of did that as an investment. So I knew a lot about it. So, initially when we started the YouTube channel, I thought, man, I'd really like to do videos talking about macro, but no one's going to watch a video on that. So initially, that was my thought.
Right.
So initially, I started doing the real estate videos. No one watched those. But then when I kind of did a few videos here and there on macroeconomics, those were the ones that really blew up. So it was perfect. I'm like, great, I'll just keep talking about it. And then the YouTube channel blew up so much that it really didn't make any sense to do the TV show again. Then we started another YouTube channel. Now we got the podcast, and that pretty much brings us to where we are today.
This would be relevant, or I guess apropos would be a better word to use, that you kind of reminded me of when you said you thought, oh, the meat and potatoes will be the real estate thing and people aren't going to care so much. I remember when Ron Paul, what was it, the 2008 campaign, if I'm not getting mixed up, that one, and he was going around and he was talking about end the Fed and stuff. And I thought, no, I've been a college professor. Kids do not care about open market operations. Talk about bring the troops home and legalize pot. And that's what you run with, Ron Paul. And otherwise the kid, and then they're all chanting end the Fed. And I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm talking about. Like, and for folks who don't know, the reason that's relevant is because George on his show has a ball cap that says end the Fed on it that he wears. Right. There it is right there.
Right there.
So people like me. It's funny, Lou Rockwell one time said something. I'm not going to get the exact quote, but it was at a Mises Institute event, and someone asked, how do you guys make it so interesting or whatever? Because normally people, monetary policy, and he says something like, well, people, if they're getting their money stolen, they like to know that, or if they're getting ripped off, that's very interesting, or something like that. You know what I mean? It was really like, right, yeah. If you're not presenting it as when the Federal Reserve wants to lower interest rates, it buys assets and that pumps reserves in it, like that's boring. But to say your dollar has been debased and these are the people and this is how they kind of do a shell game and they give money to defense contractors, all of a sudden people perk up like, wait, what will come again? What's going on? So
yeah. Exactly.
And they cause the business cycle.
Story. Yeah. And I think one of the great things that Austrian economics does is it teaches people to think in terms of thought experiments, to try to figure stuff out instead of just looking at a graph or just looking at the Phillips curve or something like that. And I think that resonates with a lot of people because it's more commonsensical.
Right. Yeah, that's something. Yeah, before we dive in, because again, folks, we're going to be talking about CBDCs. Don't worry, this isn't a bait and switch, but this does. I do want to ask you because the way you just sort of segue into this, I'm wondering, is this a real thing or is it just sampling bias? My observation is it seems like a lot of people in the financial sector who are not ideological per se, when I'll go and give a presentation on, what you and I, George, would know is Austrian business cycle theory, but I won't even call it that. I'll just say, why did the housing market get so crazy? And then I'll show what the federal, Alan Greenspan was in charge and they lowered interest rates down to 1% and held them there for a year and blah, 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 blah. And the charts are all, the story's internally consistent and it all makes sense. And people will come up afterwards and be like, oh, I hated economics in college, but what you just said, that was interesting. And it actually sounded real. And, and so to me, it seems like when budding Austrians are asking me, what should I do research on? And I say stuff pertaining to the financial markets, like they really get it, and whereas if you try to go through like academics are the last people to acknowledge it. Like they'll say, oh no, rational expectations, business people can't be fooled by the Fed. What are you talking about, idiot? But, so anyway, my question is, have you found that too, that like the Austrian school resonates more with like people in the financial sector as opposed to academics? Or is it just the kind of person that's going to like my message is the one who's going to go to an after dinner talk where I'm a speaker. So I see the crowd that was already pre-selected to like my message.
The one thing I can say is the majority of people that I've met in my life since doing this that are hedge fund managers, that are Wall Street types, that are on financial Twitter, not for Austrian economics, but just like influencers, let's say. The majority of them really, really resonate with Austrian economics.
Okay.
And again, I think it's because it makes a lot more sense. Now, there's some things that I don't agree with as far as kind of Austrian theories. But I think that even if I don't agree with it, it's not because it's inaccurate. I think that there's just more to it because there's so many variables. Yeah. And in different schools of economics, they like to distill it down to just one thing that is causing X, Y, and Z, when, especially in today's monetary system, usually it's about 100 million things that are contributing to X, Y, and Z, such as interest rates.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the Austrians are real good about thought experiments to figure out the causality, like what's the impact of this one thing. And even if you've got that nailed down, well, if there's some other factor, though, that you're not including, maybe that offsets. Kind of like a lot of Austrians in 2007 who knew there was a housing bubble were shorting the dollar. and they weren't wrong in the stuff they were saying, but I think they overlooked if there's a global financial panic, a lot of people are going to rush to the dollar for safety reasons.
Yeah, yeah, or rush to bonds, and that's going to lower rates instead of a lower time preference, I think, using Austrian terms. But, I think that takes us right into the discussion on CBDCs, Bob, and why this is such a confusing topic for people. They think it seems very straightforward. Okay, they're going to come out with FedCoin, and FedCoin can just track all the purchases. It's Big Brother. They can do negative interest rates. They can just take money out of my account. They can freeze it. They can lend based on narrative and not on merit. All these things, but it's not that simple. And when you actually think of the back-end plumbing, you understand that kind of your preconceived notions might not be accurate. And you might be looking over here when you should be looking way over there. And it allows, I think, the central planners to kind of pull the wool over your eyes. And that's why I kind of pound the table on this stuff on my videos and on Twitter. And I'm sure we can get into that in more depth.
Yeah, right. So this is your central thesis that you've been, and I was falling prey to this too. So why don't we, to make sure we're not losing, I'll let you present the case first, and then I'll show the specific thing that even I was perhaps falling into the trap of, where I might have unwittingly been pushing people to support what in effect is a CBDC. So I think
it starts with time preference though, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but with time preference, the idea there is that if time preference is lower, therefore, because you have more savings, then that means that there's going to be more lending and investment because people have that disposable income, let's say, and because there's more lending and investment, or more money to lend, and therefore investment, asset prices go up, therefore yields go down, and that is really what drives interest rates. Do I have it right?
Well, for the asset prices going up, I mean, bond prices for sure. I don't know if other assets. I mean, I guess it all kind of goes together, that if interest rates go down, other things equal, every asset that's a future thing goes up because the present discounted value goes up.
Yeah, but the main key there is that it implies that because there is more money to lend by banks, then it adjusts the supply-demand dynamic for funds, and therefore interest rates naturally go down. Two reasons: more money, and then also because of what you're talking about with buying bonds and bringing the yield down.
Right, yeah. Textbook case, if households save more, then the supply curve of loanable funds shifts to the right. And so the intersection of that and the demand for loanable funds occurs at a lower equilibrium interest rate.
So what I'd like people to do, just for the sake of this video, is let's just assume for a moment that there's no constraint on banks for lending. There's zero constraint. So if there's a lot of savings, no savings, whatever, it doesn't matter. Banks don't need savings to lend. They can just extend credit to one another. Let's just assume that that's true. So if that is true, then what we can do is we can have a different type of view of what we would consider money, what the normie would consider money, and that's just basically what their checking account balance is. But if you understand that type of money is really just a ledger system, and that's kind of where I'm going with it. It's really just a ledger system that can be manipulated by banks pretty much any way they want. And therefore, each one of these banks, like Wells Fargo or Bank of America, it just represents a simple ledger of who owes who what. I always use the example of time. And a bank ledger is simply like a clock, that it isn't really time in and of itself, but it's just measuring time. And that's the same thing that these ledgers do. So that's what most people consider, quote unquote, money. It's just basically a commercial bank liability that you can trade for goods and services. So once you kind of get
it's not even like just the man in the street. Like M1, the monetary aggregates, M1 includes, demand deposits held by the public with commercial banks. So even economists would agree checking account balances from M1 and higher are part of the money supply.
Yeah, and it gets a little confusing for people because part of the money supply, to your point with M1, is currency in circulation. So those are green pieces of paper that don't really represent a commercial bank liability. And that, you got to think about that in different terms. But, if we look at the global GDP at like 100 trillion, and we assume that 60-70% of the transactions are settled in dollars, that means there's probably 60, 70, maybe even north of that, dollars that are circulating globally, where only, 2 trillion are currency in circulation. So you've got another, let's just say 65 trillion of these dollars that are actually commercial bank liabilities that were lent into existence and simply exist on a ledger of a bank. Just like that time exists on a clock. It's just a way of keeping track of who owes who what. So once you understand this, you realize how important the ledger is, and each ledger for each bank. So what most people think as a Fed coin or a CBDC or something like this, all that really means is that we have a consolidation of all of these banking ledgers. And before we went live, you referenced the BIS report, and they talk about a global unified ledger that of course, the Klaus Schwab types would control. And so that means that each country would have their own CBDC, but those ledgers, so you'd have all the activity within a country on one ledger that would be on the central bank's balance sheet. And then that ledger would plug into the global ledger that would be controlled by, and when I say Klaus Schwab types, I'm talking about the IMF, the BIS, the World Economic Forum, the UN, the EU, one of those types of entities, if not a combination of all of them. And so this is really why it's so important to think of these things in terms of ledgers. So one of the things that prompted this discussion was something going around on Twitter from some individuals that were very free market oriented and very, I don't know if they were Austrians, but they were very, all about decentralization. And they were talking about how unfair it is for the average Joe and Jane not to get the same interest rate as Jamie Dimon. Because Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan, their reserves or some of their reserves are held on the Fed's balance sheet. It's a liability of the Fed. And as most of your viewers know, that the Fed's going to increase interest rates to, let's say, 5.25%. That's somewhere in the middle there is what they're paying on these reserves. So while JP Morgan, while Jamie Dimon's customers are only getting 1%, let's say, JP Dimon is getting 5%. They pointed out how ridiculous this is and how it's completely unfair. And they actually argued that therefore what we should do is give people the option of having an account with the Fed, just like Jamie Dimon, or just like Wells Fargo, or just like Bank of America, something like that. And I said, whoa, time out. You don't understand what you're doing there.
Hey, George, can I stop you? Let me, because you're so hip deep in this. Let me make sure we're not losing people. So before you tell them what let me make sure they get like, yeah, what's going on? It's not. And I was prey to this too. So folks, I'm not picking on anybody. So again, as George is saying, regular people, even regular companies, can't have checking accounts with the Federal Reserve itself. It's like the banker's bank, and so there's big, like J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, those big banking institutions, commercial investment bank. They're the ones that have checking accounts with the Fed. And so like part of what the monetary base is, it's like, the physical currency and also banks' reserves with the Fed. Like that's legal tender money, the way our system works right now. And so in the fall of 2008, I guess October specifically, right? Remember folks, there was the financial crisis. From that point, the Fed began paying interest on reserves. That was it had been authorized by statute earlier, but they implemented it then. And so that was a new thing.
Flooded the system with reserves.
Yes, and I was making jokes at the time about like, they said they wanted to bail out Wall Street to save Main Street, but also what they started doing was paying banks to not lend money to their customers. Like that was the way I was saying. That's one way of thinking. What's interest on reserves is the Fed saying to the banks, keep your reserves parked with us, and we'll pay you for that. Whereas before the commercial banks, that was like considered, a loss. Like if you just keep your money parked at the Fed, you get zero. If you lend it out to somebody, at least you get something. Whereas now the Fed was competing, with, and the Fed's guaranteed. Like the Fed is going to be good for it. If they say we're going to give you interest, they can, because it's just a ledger entry. Like George said, that's kind of like the MMT point. There's not like a pile of zeros and ones the Fed has to draw down. They can just add more numbers to people's checking accounts. I mean, it has economic consequences, but there's no physical constraint. And so that's the system that's been in place. So now, when the Fed says we're raising interest rates, they don't necessarily mean we're selling off assets, sucking reserves out of the system. Now there's more scarcity in the loanable funds market. And so on the margin, the interest rate on the Fed funds thing goes up, which is what textbook used to be. Now
Yeah,
it could be,
they
just pay
I don't
more.
want to cut you off there. I would disagree with that as well. That textbook thing as far as how the interest rates work prior to QE, but keep going. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
Right. Whether or not it's right or wrong, but that was the textbook thing. And I'm saying clearly they have an different institute now. When the Fed raises interest rates, how do you make the interest rate go from 5 to 5.25? It's easy. We just, instead of us paying 5%, now we're paying them 5.25, and they would be fools to lend it out to anyone for less than that, because the Fed is obviously good for it. Like, there's zero risk keeping your money parked at the Fed. And so that, of course, is going to have a ladder effect on everything else. So that's the deal. And then people, and like there was the narrow bank. This, don't worry, George, this monologue is almost over. But like the narrow bank, the TNB, they applied, and then what they wanted to do is, by narrow, they just meant, we're not making loans. We're just taking institutional money. We're going to have a master account with the Fed, and then we're just going to park it. We're going to earn the reserves that the Fed, the interest on reserves the Fed pays, and we'll pass most of that on to our customers. That's all we're going to do. And hey, there's no risk of a bank run, right? Because we're not making mortgages, and so that money's there. And so we're all talking about stability, and this is airtight. Talk about wind tunnel, boom. And the Fed kept dragging their feet, and it was a very, perfunctory thing to sign off on that application, because they were registered like Connecticut. They were like a state bank, and they just wanted to get access to the Fed. And the Fed kept saying no. And so the cynics were saying, oh yeah, because the big boys don't want to let other people into their club. They're getting the interest on reserves, but if this narrow bank is allowed to effectively pass it through to their customers, then every company is going to switch their account to them. And so the Fed wanted to nip that in the bud. And so it looks cynical, like, oh yeah, this is unfair. We all want to get on the action. Okay, so now, George, I'll hand it over to you. What are we missing? What's the danger in saying this isn't fair? Joe Schmo should get the same interest rate that Jamie Dimon gets. Yeah, we should all have accounts with the Fed.
Right. So right now, whether your viewer has an account with Wells Fargo, B of A, Citi, whatever, your dollars are a liability of that bank. And what Bob is saying there is that right now, JP Morgan, their dollar, or some of their dollars, are a liability of the Fed. So the Fed can pay them whatever interest rate they want, because the Fed has an infinite balance sheet. So in the future, I think one thing that we need to be wary of is the Federal Reserve and people that are sitting there pounding the table saying, no CBDC, no CBDC, no CBDC, but we should all have an account with the Fed, because that's what makes it equal, and that's what makes it fair, because the Fed is paying Jamie Dimon a higher interest rate. That's when, if you have this knowledge, you step in and say, no. We might want a better interest rate, but we do not. The last thing we want is for our deposits to become a liability of the Federal Reserve. Why? That's the question. Why? Because when you go through a list of all the things that we rightfully should be concerned with a central bank digital currency, none of those are possible, for the most part, without those deposits being a liability of the Fed or a central bank, being on one ledger, a unified ledger, if you will. So if we go down the list here, I apologize for looking down here, but I'm just looking at my notes. We talked about, and everyone knows about the Big Brother stuff, the social score, the climate score, being able to monitor your transactions. Well, that's almost impossible unless we have all of this data consolidated onto one ledger system, or at least the ledgers are quote unquote unified, and they'd also have to implement like a point of sale software. A lot of people are rightfully concerned about negative interest rates, but I think they should also be concerned with artificially high interest rates. The Fed could do either or, but those would be very difficult if those liabilities are still part of the commercial banking system. A freezing account, same thing. Narrative-based credit, I don't think this gets enough discussion. In the future, and I think this is definitely the way we're going when you look at reparations and all these things that they're talking about in California, why would we not lend based on narrative, or who is most deserving? Why are we even considering a credit score? Well, because the bank has to be paid back. Why do they have to be paid back? Because they got a P&L, they've got a balance sheet, they can't have negative equity. But if all of those deposit liabilities go to the Fed's balance sheet, well, now we can start issuing loans or a mortgage. We can determine interest rates, not based on you having an 800 credit score compared to someone with a 500 credit score, but we just completely eliminate that. But are you part of some sort of disadvantaged group? Or are you part of some group that has had, maybe disproportionate advantage, like maybe you're a straight white Christian male? Well, in that case, just because you're in that category, well, obviously you should be paying a much, much higher interest rate because of the white privilege that you have had since birth. and maybe someone else that's in a different group, they have a 500 credit score, but we're going to give them an interest-free $1 million loan. Why? Because they deserve it. Now, the commercial banks can't do that right now. But if the Fed was the only bank, if there was just one ledger, they cannot go bust, they could easily do this. But again, it requires all of those commercial liabilities, those dollar liabilities right now, to go from the commercial bank's balance sheet over to the Fed. And that's why we need to be so wary of this. One thing I'd like to read to you really quick, Bob, is this Wikipedia, and I'm just going to shoot over this really quick here. This is on the Gauze Bank, and I'm sure you know this, but for your listeners who don't know, this was the one bank they had in the Soviet Union between 1922 and basically 1992. The central bank and the commercial banks were one and the same. Mm-hmm. In other words, we had one ledger. So everyone's currency units in Russia was, if they were banking, the bank, were a liability of that commercial bank, one ledger. Okay, so let me read this to you. And keep in mind, this is before computers, this is before any of the talk of CBDC, any of that. The Soviet state used Gazbank primarily as a tool to impose centralized control upon industry in general, using bank balances and transaction histories to monitor the activity of individual concerns and their compliance with the 5-year plans and directives of the government. So hopefully this sounds exactly like a current day CBDC or our concerns about a CBDC. Gazbank did not act as a commercial bank in regard to profit motive. It acted theoretically as an instrument of the government policy. Instead of independently and impartially assessing creditworthiness of the borrower, Gazbank would provide loan funds to favored individuals, groups, and industries as directed by the central government. Pretty much everything that we are concerned with about a CBDC, they had in 1922 in Russia, not because they had computers and all this money that had some sort of software coded in it.
We're using blockchain, that's for sure.
That's right. Simply because they had everything on one ledger. And that is really what I try to pound the table on in social media, and I try to get people to understand.
Great. Yeah. So this is great. Let's unpack this. And folks, this may be a bit redundant, but this is really critical, everybody. So I want you to get what George is saying. So yeah, you're right. A lot of the people, we don't want Fed coin. And so people thought that, and ununderstandably so, like it's not that it was a silly thing to think, that because of the marketing too, it was like, oh, well, there's Bitcoin. And then you had all these federal officials coming forward saying, well, you can't trust these private, unregulated digital currencies like Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, because, we don't know what they're doing. They don't have reserves or anything. They don't have the full faith and credit and the regulatory apparatus to protect the consumer that, sovereign fiat currencies currently have. They might not have said fiat because that's a kind of a loaded term. And so that's why, what we're going to do with these central bank digital currencies is combine the best of both worlds, that we'll have the convenience of, digital currencies and everything like that, but with the safeguards and blah, 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 and consumer protection standards that you have come to know and trust with it when it comes to the U.S. government or whatever. And so you're right. So people were getting on their guard, and like Ron DeSantis and everybody's all geared up with their defenses up for this new type of coin,
like Fed coin, like they're going to announce it, right? Or something.
It's going to be a blockchain thing, but it's going to be run by the central bank as opposed to a decentralized ledger kind of thing. But it's still they were thinking it's going to be like Bitcoin, except the government's going to issue it. Whereas we've got these dollars that we've been using with my ATM and blah blah blah, and that's just old school. That's not a central bank digital currency. That's just dollars. Right. And your point is, well, no, you need to know what's the plumbing. They don't even need to call it something. They can still call it U.S. dollars, and the issue is just if your checking account, when you put in your ATM card, if that's going to the account held with the Fed and it's their ledger, and you're right, it doesn't need to be some new thing. It could be on an Excel spreadsheet in principle. It could be punch cards, really.
Yeah, but this takes us to a great thought experiment, or what I think is a great thought experiment that I try to encourage people to go through just to prove the point. Because everyone says, oh, they're going to come out with this new currency. They're going to call it Fed coin or something like that. And you're going to have to choose between using dollars and Fed coin. I say, no. You won't even know. They'll. And by the way, I don't think they're going to come out and announce it. Why would they do that? That makes no sense. They know that there's all this negative PR around a CBDC. So why would Biden or Jerome Powell or something say, oh, by the way, we're doing this new thing, when they know they'd get a lot of pushback on social media? No, they're not even going to announce it. So the thought experiment I always encourage people to do is, how do you know you're not using a CBDC right now? Like, you think that your dollars, that you have an account with Wells Fargo. How do you know that? Like, and if by chance Wells Fargo just transferred those deposit liabilities to the Fed balance sheet, you think you'd know about that? No, you'd still have your card. You'd still go about your day. You'd still go down to Starbucks. You'd go to Panera Bread. You'd go to the grocery store. You'd pay your car insurance. You would have absolutely no idea that those currency units, your assets, were a liability of the Federal Reserve, and they were collecting all of this information that they could then use to go ahead and issue that social score. You wouldn't know we had a CBDC until the symptoms of the CBDC start to come to surface. In other words, they start enacting those big brother type of components that we referred to earlier. But here's another thing that I think people really get wrong, Bob, is they believe that the federal government is going to it's going to force this upon the public. Like, they're going to put a gun to your head and they're going to say, we know you want to use, cash or whatever, but you can't anymore. You're going to have to use this CBDC or else you're going to jail or something like that. And I think it's going to be the complete opposite, because what most people do is they get fixated on the downside of a of a central bank digital currency, but they forget about the features. Now, I'm not talking about you and I saying that these are features, although I think we'd have to admit that they are, but I'm talking about looking at this through the lens of the normie, through the lens of the average Joe. So if we have everything unified onto a ledger, that means we have instant settlement. Instant settlement. And basically, you kind of turn base money into broad money, so you have no banks can't go bust, depositors cannot take a haircut. Like I said, they can pay you any type of interest rate they would like to. They could pay you above and beyond what they're paying JP Morgan. And let's look at, just a recent transactions here. You know that I live in Colombia, and a lot of people are expats that live overseas and whatnot. And what you could do is you could transfer your dollars into pesos. You could transfer your dollars directly into an account of, let's say, a seller. You're buying a property in Colombia. You could do that instantaneously, instant settlement, and it would all be free of charge. So for the normie who doesn't even understand the back-end implications, this is going to seem like the greatest thing since sliced bread. And what I think the central planners will do is they'll just roll out these features gradually, Bob. They're not going to come right out with a social score. They're just going to say, oh, hey, we've got this new feature, part of FedNow, that allows instant settlement. So you can do this 24/7, 365 days a year. So the average Joe looks at that, oh, well, wow. Well, this is fantastic. Boy, Bob and George keep telling me to hate the banks. Maybe they're doing something for the little guy here. And then the next thing they roll out is, by the way, next time you go to Mexico, you can go ahead and trade your dollars for pesos instantly, free of charge. Free of charge. We won't even take a haircut or a spread or anything. And if you want to go ahead and transfer your dollars into pesos instantly, and then transfer those pesos into the account of a Mexican business that would prefer pesos, you can do that instantly, 24/7, 365, and you can do that free of charge. And so there again, the average Joe, wow, whoa, man, I used to hate this Jamie Dimon guy, but boy, I'm starting to warm up to him, So they keep rolling out these features, and then what they do is they get everyone plugged into the network, and then, after 4 or 5 years or whatever, they start rolling out, oh, well, just because, of course, we want to manage disinformation and misinformation, and we've got all these, the world's a crazy place. So we're going to just issue this little score here. Nothing big, but it just determines or just tracks what you do on social media. And then, we're going to adjust people's interest rate and whatnot based on their, willingness, or, are they pushing back against vaccine mandates? Well, if so, we know that's not good for the general public. So why should that person get the interest rate on a loan that someone that's behaving is, right? So they just gradually roll this out. And another thought experiment I use, because a lot of people say, oh, well, that's going to be it. I'm never going to use that again. But, once they come out that social score, well, don't be so sure. Because right now, if I told you, hey, if you continue to use your cell phone, starting tomorrow, the government is going to give you a social score based on your cell phone usage. How many people, how many libertarians, how many people listening to this podcast right now would stop using their smartphone just tomorrow because, nope, I'm not buying into the government's, social score scheme. Very few people would drop that cell
That'd be
phone.
like
Most
asking me to
would
turn a kidney
rationalize
in. Yeah.
They'd rationalize it. They'd say, "Oh, well, Bob and George have been warning me about this CBDC, but I don't know. There's fear mongering. I mean, is it that big of a deal? I mean, I'm not breaking the law. And what have I got to hide? So what if the government knows, what I've been doing and I've been buying too much beef or diesel? I mean, they already knew that. They just rationalize it away.
I use the roads, or if there's millions of us, I'm not going to stick out. And yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is my big concern. It's the misunderstanding of the plumbing allows the central planners to pull the wool over people's eyes long enough to where they're so integrated into the network that most of them will want it to survive, and the last thing they'll want to do is leave the system.
Yeah, so let's just drive home and make sure people understand what the necessary and sufficient conditions are, and why you keep stressing it's the ledger that's the issue, not, is it a thing called is it a coin that's on a blockchain or whatever? Like, that's not so much that. The critical thing. So yeah, in principle, if everybody just had a checking account directly with the Fed, and that's what. So when you went into the grocery store and you swiped you got $100 in groceries. Again, not 100 Fed coins in groceries, $100 in groceries.
Just like you're doing now, no change.
And you swiped your thing, and instead of the grocery store interacting with Bank of America or Wells Fargo, it interacted with the Federal Reserve. And and the Fed checked and said, yep, Robert Murphy in his account with us has $360, so he can afford to pay $100, and now he's got $260. And where's that it's on the Fed's ledger. It went from saying $360 debit now, so it's $260, and the grocery store, if it's Kroger, their account went from $1 million now to $1,100,000. So it's just the Fed changing its entries on the ledger. It's keeping.
Yeah, they're just keeping score. They're just keeping
everybody,
score.
Yeah, in the U.S. That's this kind of so George's point is if it gets to that point, all of the things that you worry about FedCoin are true in that scenario.
Well, they have the ability to implement every single one of your concerns, and if they don't centralize the ledger, they don't have the ability to implement your concerns. That's I think the main point.
Yeah. So let's make sure they see why if they had that, then it's game over. So how do they turn it, like, I'm accused of a crime or something, or they don't like. I go to the grocery store, I swipe it, and the Fed says internally, yeah, he does have 360, but you know what? We've got a hold on his account because we didn't like his post on Twitter, and so they just tell the grocery store, no, we're not going to credit your account 100. So, and then the grocery store tells me, yeah, sorry, they got rejected. And that's going to be true anywhere I go, and especially if it gets to the point where there's no cash, or cash is has been discontinued, or a lot of places don't accept cash. Now I can't buy anything, and so that's how they have you. So all the things. So now, George, what people say, well, what hope is, or I can see people saying, well, how is the present system any better? Like, what do I care whether it's one big brother or whether it's 19 uncles or something, whatever the metaphor would be, that. Wells Fargo's not my buddy, and so how does that make it any different if it's not Wells? It seems like it's just an extra layer on top of that, and the commercial banks could go bankrupt if there's a bank run. So isn't it just the same kind of deal, but now there's even less certainty?
Well, the first thing that I'd say is whatever your concerns are with the CBDC, that's not possible if we have those 19 banks or 5,000 banks, if it's completely decentralized. Because how do the central planners get the information that they need in order to implement the credit score or the social score, or to adjust the social score based on what you're purchasing? And so there'd be actually two steps required here, Bob. They'd have to centralize the ledgers or unify it. They could have separate ledgers, but all of the data would have to go to the Fed's balance sheet or whatever database they were using. But you'd also have to have a point of sale software that would be unique, would be different from what we have today. And I think they'll probably implement that through the IRS. I've talked about that with my good buddy, Robert Barnes, because right now, if you go to Chipotle, your bank account, your Wells Fargo, let's say, they're going to know that you spent $20 with Chipotle. You just go on your bank statement, it says Chipotle, the date, and then $20. But they don't know whether you bought tofu or steak. You see, so that's what would have to change at the business level is they'd have to start using this universal software, then I think they'll do it through the IRS, that would say what the individual purchase or the details of the individual purchase, and then that would go to this centralized database where they could process it with artificial intelligence and then create that social score to determine what you can and can't do. But it's all about that centralization and that point of sale software. And then we talk about that narrative-based lending. A bank can't do that. A bank cannot do that. So if we have 19 banks or 5,000 or whatever, as long as your dollars are a liability of an entity that is concerned about profit and loss and that can go bust, you're going to have credit-based lending. Unless the Fed's buying the debt or something like that. But if they're going to implement these, reparations, UBI is another example. If they're going to try to increase the velocity of money in the future by saying that you have to spend it by this amount of date, again, that requires that the dollar liabilities go to the Fed's balance sheet, because it requires being on a balance sheet or a balance sheet of an entity that cannot go bust. It can easily have negative equity. And we know that the Fed can, because they've got negative equity right now.
Well, there was also, let me just make sure, because I think some people, when they're viewing it as a all or nothing, black and white, that, if you're just a complete pariah, you're Osama bin Laden or something, and they shut you down. But no, there's zones, and there was even a guy, I'm sure you saw this, George. Maybe we can we'll insert the clip, folks, if we can find it here. I don't want to overpromise, but it was making the rounds where the guy said something like, and I think he was connected with the WEF, saying, and we could do a thing with the central bank digital currency where, if somebody shouldn't be buying a firearm, we can just not authorize those transactions.
Right.
You could have, as I argue in my book, a potentially better and some people might see it, or a darker world where the government decides that units of central bank money can be used to purchase some things, but not other things that it deems less desirable, like, say, ammunition or drugs or pornography or something of the sort. And that is very powerful in terms of the use of a CBDC.
Right, so it's not just an all or nothing. Are you allowed to participate in commerce? They could say certain people can't buy guns. And then, how would that work? Well, it wouldn't be that they'd be on a no gun list necessarily. It would just be that the gun dealers, when they go to run for a purchase, the bank would know, the central bank would know, wait a minute, this is a firearms transaction. This person is on our list of who's not allowed to have a gun. And so we're just not going to disperse the funds. And I think, too, that's a way they could kind of skirt constitutional issues and say, no, we're not saying you can't buy a gun. We're just saying you can't use dollars through our system to pay for one. But if that's the only really effective way you can ever pay somebody for anything, then it's kind of the same thing, even though they might argue legally, well, no, we're not violating the Second Amendment by doing that. This is monetary policy.
Yeah, one of my biggest concerns, Bob, is what we see playing out right now in China. And that's because, you talk about Bitcoin being a solution, gold, silver. I think those are part of the solution, but they're by no means a panacea. Because I think, going back to this point of sale software, they'll require your identity before you make a purchase. Mm-hmm. Therefore, regardless of if you're using green pieces of paper or gold or Bitcoin, they're still going to know that, and that's still going to be attached to or factor into your social score. What we're seeing in China right now is if you have a bad or a negative social score, they're not allowing you to travel. They're just simply taking your ID. And so, one of the things that I think about a lot is, okay, if they implement this, well, I'm just going to go to some other country where I'm treated better or something like that. And then where I can use my cash, or I can use my gold, or I can use my Bitcoin. But if you get on the wrong side of things, you could find yourself in the United States to where, sure, you've got all this Bitcoin, you've got all this gold, you've got all this silver, cash, whatever, but you can't leave because you don't have a passport, or your passport's completely invalid. And if you don't think they can pull that off, I would remind people to go right back to 2020 and see how far you could get outside of the United States, even with a U.S. passport. And I don't care if you're a trillionaire, I don't care how much gold or Bitcoin or real estate or dollars you have, you're not leaving the U.S. because no country will let you in based on a U.S. passport. So just think about that. If you didn't have that passport to begin with, what do you do? Where do you go? And I think that's something that people really need to think about.
Okay, so I think we've done a good job of alerting people to these dangers, and clearly they realize, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't just clamor to get the same interest on reserves that Jamie Dimon gets, because that, and by the way, I think what they'll do, George, is make it optional at first. They might open it up to like major companies and whatever, and then just gradually roll it out.
Totally.
And
agree.
then people will feel like suckers. Like, wait a minute, why am I getting 1% in my commercial bank when I could be getting 4% with an account directly with the Fed? That's a no-brainer. And then
if the banking crisis continues, Bob, people are going to run toward the Fed because why would I risk taking a haircut with Silicon Valley Bank or my regional bank when I could just take my dollars, move it to the Fed, and I have zero chance of a haircut?
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, so I think that's clearly like the way they would do it. And, they might allow, they wouldn't outlaw commercial banks. They no, go ahead. But just people doing the math realize this is stupid, and they all switch over, and the commercial banks go out of business one by one.
I don't know if they even go out of business because I still think the Fed would utilize them for the loan origination. So very similar to what they do right now with Fannie and Freddie. Wells Fargo isn't going to keep that loan on their books. They're going to sell that to Fannie and Freddie before the ink's dry. But they're just going to take kind of a fee, and they don't care if they're getting a big enough fee. And the Fed, I don't think, is really going to want to deal with the average Joe as far as the lending. But what they'd have is lending guidelines that for the loan originators, they would have to abide by, and part of that would be your social score.
Okay, yeah. And also you're addressing, because I did get pushback when I had you on a different podcast a few months ago. I got some pushback from someone like, yeah, I love Georgia, but that's never going to happen because the commercial banks wouldn't allow it because they'd be able to look.
Want this.
Yeah, they'd look two moves ahead.
Why do I want to deal with a stupid customer when I could make just as much money, if not more, just being a loan originator?
Well, right. So you answered the question. That's what they would be doing. So they would have a role to play because they couldn't just be completely cut out of it. The Fed wouldn't do everything because then there's nothing left for the commercial banks to do, and they're a pretty powerful group of people that couldn't just be written off. So yeah, I think you've answered like the show.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, J.P. Morgan owns the Fed.
Right.
So it's Gosbank, at a certain level. You know what I mean? But I think the good news here, I know you wanted to get into that. I do think that there is some good news, but it requires being prepared. And I think that one of my main messages is don't assume we're dealing with a very strong opponent right now. And I always use the example of John Jones in the UFC. I don't know if you're a big UFC fan, but John Jones is regarded by most as the best UFC fighter to ever step in the octagon. So, Bob, if you and I are fighting John Jones in 2 weeks, are we going to look at his weaknesses, or are we going to look at his weaknesses and his strengths? Obviously, if we want to win this, if we don't want to get pummeled, we are going to look at both. And we're going to be very cognizant of both his strengths and his weaknesses. Therefore, we can come up with the best game plan to have the highest probability of maybe not winning, but even surviving with John Jones. And it's the exact same thing with this CBDC. We can't bury our head in the sand and say, oh, this doesn't have any features. Oh, this is draconian. Oh, this is this, this is this, this is this. When in reality, it's going to have a lot of features that the average Joe and Jane are going to absolutely love. So we have to be honest with ourselves about that first and foremost. And then I think we also have to be honest in the sense that there's no certainties, only probabilities. But I think right now the probability is extremely high that we do have a CBDC within the next, call it 5 years. And I think that it's very high that we will have a social score. But I think the probability, especially in the United States, is very low that the states will actually recognize the social score. The way I think through this is it's very similar to the vaccine mandate that we had, I call it the medicine mandate, that we had in 2020, 2021. That, yeah, sure, you could have that card, right, that said that you'd received the medicine. But if you're in Texas, it doesn't even matter. Like, no one is checking your card to let you into a restaurant. Where if you're in New York, then it really, really matters. So what I'm saying there is I think that everyone will probably have a social score, if you look on the BIS's website or the Fed's website or something like that. But if you're in Texas, it's not even really matter, or in Florida or something like that, because the local government isn't even going to recognize, like, it's not even a thing. Who cares? Where if you go to New York or California, it's going to completely dictate how you can live your life. So the good news there is I think that there's going to be some differentiation between jurisdictions and within the United States itself and from country to country.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so as you know, like, part of what I'm doing with Infinio and other places, we're trying to build up infrastructures and financial payments, and I know like at your Rebel Capitalist Live event, a lot of people there are working on like parallel systems and things like that. Is that complementary to what you're talking about? That like just so groups of people, so people might, yeah, my US dollar account got shut down, but you know what? I have all these other things, and the important thing is I'm in a network of people who are willing to trade with me based on these other forms of payment.
This is going to be crucial.
Okay.
Yeah, because I've gone over this in a whiteboard video, you know, assuming this is the way it plays out. And again, I want to be very clear. This is just my ideas. I've thought through it a lot, but there are no certainties. But if it plays out this way, I think people have to accept the fact that for a certain amount of time, you're going to have to live within this system. Now, it's not going to be forever, but, you know, if people push back with Bitcoin and different techniques that you're referring to and gold and whatnot. And I agree, that is definitely part of the solution. But this takes a long time. You know, right now, if you tried to live your life spending only Bitcoin for a week, you'd have a tough time. You know, you couldn't pay your rent. You couldn't, maybe if you lived in El Salvador. But if you lived in these other places, that would be very difficult. You would still have to take that Bitcoin and turn it into dollars, or the business would have to take those Bitcoin and turn them into dollars. You'd need this on-ramp type of off-ramp thing. But so if they implemented the CBDC tomorrow, Bob, I don't think the infrastructure is set up there. I don't think there are enough businesses that are willing to trade with individuals for something outside of dollars to where you could maintain your standard of living. It would be like kind of living in an Amish community or something like that, which may be fine for most people, but most people wouldn't really want that. So what you have to do is you got to think of some sort of hybrid system, right? And so let's just assume that you have to have an account there because you got to get paid. How are you going to get your paycheck? You know, unless you have a bank account, and the only account is with the Fed. So how do you get around that? So I think that you have to get paid from your employer. You don't have a choice. And then you go ahead and make some of your payments, rent, whatever you have to do. But then if you could take anything left over, and maybe if they still allow this, then maybe turn that into Bitcoin or turn that into gold or silver, and you use that for kind of your dry powder. And then when you have to transact and you can do it outside of the system, then you go ahead and take that Bitcoin or gold or silver and you either transact with that, or if that's not an option, which it won't be everywhere, then you turn that into cash. And then you kind of just use that as kind of a hybrid type of system to buy time until we can build up this network and this infrastructure for a payment system that's parallel to that current payment system that has enough goods and services on it that you can actually transfer over to that parallel system completely without reducing your standard of living.
Yeah. I think that a lot of us have kind of landed on that same solution and realizing that, yeah, it's probably not going to be able to stop the introduction of these other things we're talking about. Instead, you know, building up duplicate or redundant systems.
I think they fall victim to this idea that, okay, well, when they roll this out, no problem. I'm just going to go ahead and transact with gold, silver, and Bitcoin and tell them to pound sand. Well, again, you got to be careful with that because not too many people, you know, when you look at a basket of all the goods and services that you buy on a daily basis, most likely you can't get 100% of those, if most likely a very small fraction, with using those as payment methods. So again, it's not that it won't happen, but this may be, let's say, 10 years down the line. You know, one of the problems with Bitcoin, as an example, is very volatile. Now, it might not be volatile forever. There's a lot of different factors that could make it less and less and less volatile. And then it could be a much more, it could be far more desirable from the normie standpoint because you don't have these massive swings and therefore accepted by a lot more businesses than it is today, and yada, yada, yada. But that's going to, even, you know, the Bitcoin maxis say realistically, that's going to take 5, 10 plus years. It's not going to happen overnight. So my point is, if we get this CBDC before then, which we very well could, we've got to think of how we navigate that system before we get to a point where we've set up this parallel kind of economy. I always say, you know, one thing I say on my whiteboards, I say, don't hesitate, just navigate. Because so many people get so caught up with fear, they lose sleep, that they can't take action. They can't even think about this. They get so hesitant. But don't hesitate, just learn how to navigate.
I think I need to start building up a tolerance for tofu. That's what I'm hearing.
Right. Or at least have someone within your community that is a big fan of tofu. There's another way that you can kind of maybe navigate is if you consume a lot of diesel, let's say, but your buddy consumes a lot of meat, and let's say that he doesn't consume any diesel and you don't consume any meat or something like that, then he can buy what you use more of and you can buy what he uses more of, and you just got to figure out a way to communicate that within your inner circle. But this is the way we have to start to think. We can't just put our head in the sand and say that nobody's going to want this CBDC because it's got a social credit score.
Right. Yeah.
Or that it's somehow a competing currency or something like that. We've got to be aware of the plumbing.
Yeah, and it is unfortunate. It's sort of a shame that we know if 70%, probably not even that many, just said, no, we're not doing this, period, it wouldn't happen. But they'll figure out a way. Like you said, they won't be forced to do it. People they'll clamor for this thing.
But this is I've thought about this a lot. I said, okay, yes, it is true. Throughout history, one of the ways that we win is just for a small vocal percentage to stand up and say no. That's it. No. Whether it's Romania in 1989, whether it's the truckers in Canada, the same thing. They just stand up and say no. The problem with that is that if they implement the CBDC, most people won't even know about it.
Right.
In fact, we could be using a CBDC right now, Bob, both of us, and not even know that we're doing it. So how do we know when to even stand up and say no?
Yeah.
If it's not right there in front of our eyes? And then who do you say no to, by the way? Let's just say that it's a global unified ledger and that it's run by the BIS and the World Economic Forum and all these different jurisdictions throughout the entire world. Who do you stand up and say no to? It becomes a tricky question.
Yeah. So to be clear for folks, like what we're doing right now and why I had you on and why you're going around enunciating it is you are trying to alert people. So it's not that you're throwing in the towel in terms of education and just having the citizens be informed, but you're saying let's not put all our eggs in that one basket. I'm
trying to tell people that we're going into a fight with John Jones. Now we can win, but we will not win if we just say, "Oh, this guy's he's old. He's list all of these things why somehow his weaknesses." Now you're setting yourself up to fail.
All right,
but what we have to do is we have to acknowledge that John Jones is the best of all time, and we've got to look at his weaknesses, but we also have to acknowledge his strengths. We've got to be realistic about this, for heaven's sakes, if we want any hope of winning.
Yeah. Okay, so where do people, you keep talking about your whiteboard, where do people go to hear more of you if you've intrigued them?
They can just go to George Gammon on YouTube, and my George Gammon channel comes up with the whiteboard videos, or I've got another channel called Rebel Capitalist, where I do live stream and talk about these issues nonstop.
Okay, great. So thanks, George, for your time. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Then thank you folks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.